King is what the sign said. But it didn't look like a royal scene. No thrones, nothing fancy. The opposite. It looked like what it was. 3 outlaws on a cross. 2 for what they did, 1 for what he was about to do. It was not what we expected. We had hoped God would come close. But this close? With his blood in our dirt?
In the ancient world, when crucifixion was the sort of thing that happened, you don't find many people writing about it. Such was its terror. Writers didn't seem to think that they wanted to spend any time describing that. And yet, we have these 4 texts that have survived, form part of our Bible, where 4 different authors write about this moment of crucifixion of Jesus. We've heard one of them already this morning, but Good Friday, as it gathers itself around this story of the cross, it's important for us to spend time in the Scripture and resonate with these different stories. So let me read John's account to you. In John's Gospel, chapter 19, it says this: "Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. And so the soldiers took charge of Jesus. Carrying his own cross, he went out to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with 2 others, one on each side, and Jesus in the middle. Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross. It read, 'Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews.' Many of the Jews read this sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city. And the sign was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. The chief priests of the Jews protested to Pilate, 'Do not write the King of the Jews, but that this man claimed to be the King of the Jews.' Pilate answered, 'What I have written, I have written.' When the soldiers crucified Jesus, they took his clothes, dividing them into 4 shares, one for each of them, with the undergarment remaining. This garment was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. 'Let's not tear it,' they said to one another. 'Let's decide by lot who will get it.' And this happened that the scripture might be fulfilled that said, 'They divided my clothes amongst them and cast lots for my garment.' And so, this is what the soldiers did. Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, 'Woman, here is your son,' and to the disciple, 'Here is your mother.' And from that time on, this disciple took her into his home. Later, knowing that everything had now been finished, and so that scripture would be fulfilled, Jesus said, 'I am thirsty.' And a jar of wine vinegar was there, so they soaked a sponge in it, put the sponge on a stalk of the hyssop plant, and lifted it to Jesus' lips. When he had received the drink, Jesus said, 'It is finished.' And with that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit." 2019's Holy Week has been interesting, to say the least. We began this week already knowing that provincial elections were probably going to distract us a little bit from remembering the death and resurrection of Jesus. But then on Monday, a new story crashed into our headlines. Notre Dame de Paris, the famous Gothic French cathedral, bursts into a 15-hour fire. The firefighters tell us left it perhaps only 15 minutes from total destruction. The pictures have captured the world in potentially unexpected ways. In the capital of one of Europe's most secular and divided cities, in the middle of Holy Week, there's been this outpouring of grief about a church. Did we really know that a church had such symbolic significance? Less surprising, perhaps, in the world that we live in today has been the plethora of comments and opinions filling the news cycles, papers, and internet channels. And one in particular, an article considering the beauty, spirit, and symbolism of Notre Dame, in, of all things, Rolling Stone magazine, offered this stark thought. Patricio Del Real, Harvard professor of art and architecture, said, "The building was so overburdened with meaning that its burning feels like an act of liberation." I mean, the idea that something can have too much meaning probably says everything we need to know about what's wrong with Western society. But it's a stark thought for us on Holy Week of all weeks, culminating as it does in this moment around a cross. The cross was a scandal for early Christians, a punishment for slaves and rebels, a vile death so terrible that centuries passed before any Christian used it in art, before any church would hang the cross anywhere as something they wanted to remember. But what about its meaning? Are we, as a group of 21st century people, prepared to place meaning on the cross on a morning like this? Can we say that the crucifixion of Jesus was a real event, that his blood flowed in our dirt, and that this means something? And part of our story this morning, you see, is that the cross is burdened with meaning, but a burden that doesn't overbear it, but a burden that it intends to bear. And perhaps our journey as Christians over the years has not been that we've overburdened the cross with meaning, but perhaps that we've underburdened it. Perhaps it means more than we think. Perhaps its implications are wider than we think. At its core, the cross is an announcement that something has happened, that God has done something. In Romans 5 and verse 8, a famous passage which Eugene Peterson translates like this: God put his love on the line for us by offering his Son in sacrificial death while we were of no use whatever to him. You see, the cross is something of God's critique of the human situation. We are in need of and in search of wholeness, fulfillment, and peace. But we're utterly incapacitated in our ability to obtain it. And possibly more significant is that we're often generally oblivious to this fact. It doesn't seem to strike us, our incapacity. We seem to spend much of our life convincing ourselves that we're doing really quite well at this thing called humanity. But the cross asks a question of that. God on a cross asks a question of that. And at the root of this story we call Easter, is a God who moves first. And this is the key of the story of Easter. This is the one thing perhaps we should never forget about the Easter story. Easter isn't the story about how we get close to God. It's the story about how he got close to us. The trajectory of God is towards us. And it's at this dark moment of Easter, God on a cross, that the true nature of God is truly revealed. The centurion stands and looks at this Jesus on a cross, and it's only at that moment, it's only in those moments that the centurion says, surely this man was the Son of God. Did it take a cross to recognize that? Is it somehow strange that in the cross it's the moment that God becomes clear to us, that he is revealed to us? Is this who God really is? And so the cross reveals to the world a momentous truth, that to be the victim, to be the sacrificial one, might be the source of strength. And that's not often the story that we tell. Modernity's most vociferous critic of Christianity saw this clearer than most. Friedrich Nietzsche says it like this: the measure of a man's compassion for the lowly and suffering comes to be the measure of the loftiness of his soul. Nietzsche realizes that Christianity has changed the way that we think about being human. It's changed the way that we think about how it is that we live out our lives. And here he says begrudgingly that somehow it's our compassion for the lowly and suffering that marks out who we are. We often say that Jesus is the answer. And if he is the answer, it's the answer in the way it's portrayed upon the cross. But I wonder if this is worth reflecting on for us this Good Friday morning. Human progression is such that it's easy to believe our own marketing. I don't know if you've noticed that. Maybe we are really like gods. Our science is unbelievable. Our economics are unsurpassed. Our technology unrestrained. We have within our powers the ability to destroy ourselves. Many of the world leaders wander around with briefcases never more than 3 steps from them that could end all of life. We really have come far. But then if we sit back and watch our news cycles and we listen to what's going on in the world, what are our issues in the world today? What is it that humanity is really struggling with? And I want to suggest to us this morning, in the shadow of a cross, that all of the world's major issues today are ethical ones. I don't think our major issues in the world today are around what we can and cannot do, but rather they seem to me to be around what we ought and ought not to do. We can do whatever we want, but should we? And this is where we realize that the cross cannot be dismissed easily. This scandalous death has an audacious reality about it. What is it that Paul, Christianity's most famous missionary, says? He says, God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose a cross to show us a new way to be. This God who is close to the weak, closer to the weak than the mighty, closer to the downtrodden than the powerful, is showing us in this moment on the cross how we should live, what our morals should look like, what our ethics should look like, how we should behave. Just because we have unlimited power doesn't mean we should use it. And so I want to return to a moment at the top of our sermon when we read this text from John's Gospel. A moment that we remember during the Stations of the Cross. Jesus speaking to his mother. The text says that as Jesus is in the final moments of his life, as he's about to die, what might you think about as you're about to die? What might you have go through your mind if you were in Jesus' position? And yet, because the cross is this constant reminder, not only of what God has done, but how God thinks we should be, we have this display of power that looks unusual to us. Because it's not power the way we know it in the world, but it's an ethic that's so strong that it even overcomes the final moments of Jesus' life. Here is your son, and here is your mother. Jesus reaches out of the pain and the tragedy and brings 2 people together to love each other. Fleming Rutledge says it like this: at the same time that his universal kingship is announced, Jesus turns his failing eyesight down to the people standing on the trash-strewn ground covered with blood and human waste, and he gives these 2 disciples to one another. And here is where the church starts. Right in the midst of Jesus' suffering, we see the beginning of something, but not something built on strength, something built on weakness. The single autonomous person that we love so much in Western society may have the capacity for power, but they also have immense capacity for destruction. And so Jesus from the cross speaks of an ethic of community. We cannot be Jesus' disciple without being in communion with each other. Jesus didn't separate us out as individuals and pronounce us as unique and individual. We want him to do that, and we try so hard to read the story to make it a story just about me. Even in some of our language on Good Friday, it sneaks in to make this a story about me. But Jesus didn't make us independent and self-centered, but he made us mutually interdependent and other-directed. He washed our feet, and he told us to love one another. This particular image seemed to dominate this week. This image of inside of Notre Dame, where the roof has collapsed, and yet somehow this golden cross has survived amidst the rubble. It's a particularly ironic image at some level, this haunting gold cross there amongst all of this debris. On one hand, however, the story of the following week around this cross suggests that maybe there's some hope for us as humans, as people have reached deep into those darkest parts of our pockets and produced finance to help rebuild this. And it's hopeful that perhaps people do come together to rebuild things. But this story also speaks to our brokenness. France has 30,000 homeless children, and we could only find money for a building. Perhaps we are in dire need of the ethic of the cross, of a way of being that is different, that is sacrificial. Jesus, the God who comes close to our space, puts two people together, mother and disciple. And it's fascinating in the story as it's told that Pilate unwittingly does something profound for us. He proclaims Jesus as king, but don't miss that he proclaims it in all the languages of the world, in Aramaic, in Latin, and in Greek, so that no one near the sign would not be able to read that this is the king. And unwittingly, Pilate says something profound because he is the king, and he's the king of everyone who has come close. And as much as he wants to put disciple and mother together, he wants to put all of us back together again. Alberta, like Paris, like Jerusalem, has had a difficult week. Some people won, other people lost. And in the rubble of that, there's an opportunity to choose your ethic, to show off your power, or choose the ethic of the cross. And I think that's part of the burden of meaning that the cross can bear. An ethic that can look from the rubble at two people and say to them, perhaps say to all of us, build something new together.